Hey everyone, welcome back. You guys really wanted us to do a deep dive into this whole Russia, Ukraine, and the West situation. And let me tell you, it's a lot more complicated than the headlines make it seem.
It really is. We could easily spend hours just unpacking the historical context below.
Okay, so let's start there then. Most people remember the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
But it sounds like that might not be the most accurate way to describe what happened.
Exactly. The word collapse kind of implies like a sudden chaotic implosion.
Right.
But in reality, it was a much more kind of a politically driven process. It was set in motion by Gorbachev and his policies of glasnost and perestroika.
Glasnost and perestroika.
Yeah, openness and restructure, which were pretty unprecedented at the time. And that period was just filled with this immense hope, but also these tremendous challenges for the people who were living through it. I mean, just imagine you're facing like 3 simultaneous revolutions.
Oh, hold on. 3 revolutions at once.
Exactly.
What were they?
So first, you've got the economic transition, like going from a centrally planned economy to a market economy practically overnight. I mean, this wasn't just about like shifting economic models or whatever. This was a complete upheaval of daily life for people.
I can imagine.
And for Russia specifically, it's important to understand that their planned economy, it wasn't like in ruins or anything. It had actually built their industrial base. So this transition was incredibly complex.
Right.
Then on top of that, you've got the political revolution, like going from a one-party communist state to trying to build a constitutional structure. So essentially rewriting their entire system of governance.
Yeah.
And then third, you have this revolution of national identity, going from a multinational union to a nation state.
Wow.
And all of this is happening while the West is like holding Russia accountable for the Soviet Union's past.
Right.
But at the same time, giving all these other former Soviet states a fresh start.
Oh, so like a double standard.
Exactly. And that immediately created these biases that I think still influence perceptions today.
So while the West was celebrating the end of the Cold War, it sounds like for many Russians, it felt like a loss of identity, a loss of security.
Exactly. And that feeling, that sense of loss and resentment, it really shaped their view of the West going forward.
And I imagine that played a role in the rise of Putin, right?
Very ever.
Because things got even more chaotic with Yeltsin.
Right.
No.
Oh, yeah. Yeltsin came in with this image of being like a reformer, a Democrat. But the reality on the ground was brutal. Like you had this kind of Wild West, capitalism take hold, rampant corruption, the rise of the oligarchs through these dubious privatizations, and all those Western ideals that they had been promised, like liberalization and democratization. They ended up causing real suffering for ordinary Russians.
And that just discredited those very concepts.
Well, precisely.
So you've got this backdrop of instability and disillusionment, and then Putin steps in.
Right.
This young athletic figure promising to restore order and national pride after the perceived weakness of the Yeltsin era.
Exactly. He really tapped into that longing for stability and strength. But even in those early days, there were signs that the West either missed or chose to ignore. I mean, during his first term, Putin made numerous overtures to the West. He even proposed this idea of a common European house.
Like a partnership?
Yeah. But these were all met with either rejection or indifference.
So there's a real chance for a different path, a chance to integrate Russia into the European security framework.
There really was. And now we're left wondering, is Russia driven by genuine security concerns or by imperial ambitions?
It's the question everyone's asking.
Right. And it's a question that requires us to look at the facts, not just ideology or moral judgments. We need to consider Russia's unique geopolitical situation. You know, a vast landmass with over 22,000 kilometers of land borders, 14 neighbors, and a history of invasions from both East and West.
Right. They've been invaded from all sides throughout history.
Exactly. Now compare that to the United States, geographically secure between 2 oceans with just 2 neighbors. And you can start to understand why their threat perceptions might be a little different.
Their history, their geography, it all shapes how they see the world.
Exactly.
And then you have NATO expansion.
Right. NATO's eastward expansion, despite assurances given to Russia, was a major turning point. And I don't think people in the West really grasp what that meant for Russia. This wasn't just some abstract geopolitical maneuver.
Right. It felt like a threat.
Imagine you've been invaded repeatedly throughout history. And now this military alliance led by your former Cold War rival keeps creeping closer and closer to your border.
I mean, that would be unsettling, to say the least.
Absolutely. And even George Kennan, the architect of America's Cold War containment policy. He called NATO expansion a tragic mistake. He predicted it would lead to a nasty reaction from Russia.
And this brings us to Ukraine, which holds a particularly significant place in Russia's historical and emotional landscape.
Right. Absolutely. Ukraine wasn't just another country to Russia. It's deeply intertwined with their shared history and culture. So NATO's encroachment there was seen as crossing a red line.
It was a threat to their identity. And it's important to remember that the U.S. involvement in Ukraine went far beyond just military aid.
You're absolutely right. There were allegations of U.S. interference in Ukrainian elections, funding for pro-NATO educational programs, and even reports of secret CIA bases operating near the Russian border for years.
Yeah. So it was a multi-pronged approach.
It was.
Yeah.
And these actions, coupled with the West's dismissal of Russia's formal requests for security guarantees, they further escalated tensions and eroded trust.
It's like a whole chapter of the story is missing from the mainstream narrative.
Exactly.
But before we get into that, let's talk about the war itself and its consequences.
Right.
Because it's easy to forget that just a few weeks after the war began, there were actually successful negotiations mediated by Israel in Istanbul.
Oh, yeah, that's right. They were incredibly close to a diplomatic resolution, even remerged in Crimea.
So peace was within reach.
It seemed that way. But then the West, prioritizing its goal of weakening Russia, essentially sabotaged those talks.
Seriously.
Yeah, a decision that some argue prioritized geopolitical goals over Ukrainian lives.
That's a sobering thought. That a peaceful resolution was possible, but the desire to weaken Russia ultimately prevailed.
It's a tragedy.
And now, after years of fighting, this situation on the ground seems increasingly dire.
The situation is bleak. Ukraine's counteroffensive has stalled. They're facing critical shortages in personnel and equipment. Russia, on the other hand, continues to make advances in the Donbas region, which is strategically very important.
So the longer this war drags on, the greater the risk of things spiraling out of control.
Absolutely. The risk of desperation driving dangerous decisions is very real, especially as Ukraine's resources dwindle.
And this brings us to the question of Germany and the EU's role in all of this.
Right, because they're caught in a really difficult position, having seemingly prioritized U.S. interests over their own.
So they're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place.
In a way, they've failed to articulate their own strategic goals, and their lack of independent action has been concerning.
It's a far cry from the Ostpolitik of the 1970s.
Exactly, which was this policy of engagement with the East. You know, it demonstrated the benefits of dialogue and cooperation, even during the Cold War.
So instead of following that model of Ostpolitik, which emphasized dialogue and cooperation, they've aligned themselves more closely with the U.S. approach.
It seems that way.
But what about Germany's own citizens? How are they reacting to all of this, especially the planned deployment of U.S. hypersonic missiles on their soil?
That's where things get particularly interesting, because there's been a concerning lack of public discourse in Germany regarding these crucial decisions.
It's like a major shift is happening right under their noses, and there's barely a whisper of dissent.
That's right, and that's something we need to unpack further.
Yeah, it's kind of wild when you think about it. I mean, here we have this decision with the potential to like dramatically escalate tensions.
Right.
And yet it's just happening, like no real debate.
Yeah.
No consideration of the consequences. Right. And it's such a contrast to how things were handled in the past.
Yeah.
You know, like take the NATO double track decision of 1979
Yeah.
that involved deploying these intermediate range nuclear missiles in Europe.
Yeah.
And it sparked years of intense debate, like parliamentary debate, societal debate, even within NATO itself. There were strong disagreements.
Exactly.
It took 4 years for the German parliament to actually approve the deployment of those Pershing 2-7 missiles. And that approval came amidst these massive protests, like some of the largest Germany had ever seen.
Yeah, it's like back then there was this real sense of urgency, this recognition of how serious the situation was, you know?
Right.
But today it's like that sense of urgency has been replaced by what? Like complacency? Resignation? I don't know.
Yeah, it's a good question. So what changed? Why this shift towards secrecy and a lack of transparency?
Well, part of it is that this decision to deploy these hypersonic missiles, it wasn't made on a whim, you know? It was a long time in the making. Like under the Obama administration, the U.S. had already decided on this deployment. And then in 2017, under Trump, the U.S. Army started establishing this multi-domain task force structure specifically for this purpose. And here's the key point. Concrete preparations for stationing one of these task forces in Wiesbaden, Germany. They began on April 13, 2021.
So like a year before the war in Ukraine even started.
Exactly. So long before the Russian attack on Ukraine. So it seems like the conflict is being used as a justification to push through a decision that was already made.
It's like they were just waiting for the right moment.
Right. The fear surrounding the conflict is being leveraged to stifle any meaningful discussion or dissent. You know, it's a classic case of using a crisis to advance a pre-existing agenda.
It's cynical, but it makes sense.
Yeah. And it raises the question of what about Germany's own strategic interests? Where do they fit into all of this?
Right. Like, are they even being considered?
That's the million-dollar question. It seems like Germany, and to a large extent the EU, have become overly reliant on the US for their security policy, They've failed to articulate their own independent vision for Europe's future.
It's a stark departure from the Ostpolitik era.
It really is, which was based on this understanding that Germany's interests were best served by maintaining good relations with both the East and the West.
And Ostpolitik was remarkably successful, wasn't it?
Right.
Like, despite the Cold War tensions, it led to decades of stability and cooperation.
It did.
So is there anything we can learn from that era? Anything we can apply to the current situation?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Ostpolitik was based on this idea of Wandel durch Annäherung,
Right.
change through rapprochement.
Right.
And it recognized that even when you have these profound ideological differences, dialogue and engagement are essential for building trust and reducing tensions.
So it's about finding common ground.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Fostering economic and cultural exchange, recognizing that shared humanity that binds us even across political divides.
Okay. So instead of viewing Russia as an adversary, we need to find ways to cooperate, to build bridges instead of walls.
Right.
But how do we do that in this current climate? Like, the level of mistrust and hostility is so high.
It won't be easy, that's for sure. It requires a willingness to engage in those difficult conversations, to listen to perspectives that challenge our own, and to seek solutions that benefit all parties involved.
It's about moving beyond that zero-sum game mentality.
Exactly, which has dominated international relations for far too long.
Yeah. And speaking of challenging perspectives, you mentioned earlier how language is often used to demonize opponents.
Right.
Like, certain terms are consistently used to portray Russia negatively, while similar actions by the West are kind of overlooked or excused.
Exactly. Language is a powerful tool, and it's often weaponized in conflicts. Like, for instance, you take the term invasion, right? It's frequently used to describe Russia's actions in Ukraine. And while it's true that Russian forces crossed the border, it's crucial to remember the complex historical context surrounding this event, like the annexation of Crimea in 2014, for example. It was met with condemnation from the West, but it was also supported by a majority of the Crimean population who identify as Russian.
Right. It was a disputed territory.
Exactly. And then you have the situation in the Donbas region where a civil war had been raging for years. That's even more nuanced.
Right. So the portrayal of Russia as the sole aggressor kind of ignores the internal divisions within Ukraine and the role of Ukrainian nationalist groups in the conflict.
Precisely.
It's like we're constantly being bombarded with information, but it's often filtered through a very specific lens. you know? And it's up to us to be discerning, to question the narratives we're being fed, and to see out multiple perspectives.
You got it. It's about being critical consumers of information, not passive recipients.
Right.
We need to be aware of the biases inherent in any media coverage and be willing to dig deeper to uncover the complexities that are often hidden beneath the surface.
And that includes being aware of the way language is used to dehumanize opponents.
Absolutely.
Like, we see this all the time, right? Certain groups are labeled as terrorists or enemies of the state without any due process or consideration for the complexities of their motivations and actions.
Right. And that kind of rhetoric is incredibly dangerous because it creates a climate of fear and intolerance, and it makes it easier to justify violence and aggression.
It's like, once you label someone as an enemy, it's easier to dehumanize them.
Exactly. And it's essential to remember that even in the midst of conflict, there are always human beings on all sides with their own hopes and fears and aspirations.
So it's not about choosing sides.
Right.
It's about recognizing the power of language.
Yeah.
And being mindful of how it's used to manipulate our perceptions and emotions.
Exactly. It's about being critical thinkers and demanding accountability from those in power.
Whether it's politicians or media outlets or anyone else who seeks to influence public opinion.
You got it.
It's like we're learning a new language.
Yeah.
The language of critical thinking and nuanced understanding. And it's a language that's essential for navigating this complex world we live in.
Couldn't agree more. It's a language that empowers us to see beyond the surface, to question assumptions, to challenge the status quo, and ultimately, it's a language that's essential for building a more just and peaceful world.
Well said. And on that note, we'll continue exploring some of those complexities in just a moment. Okay, so we're back. And we've covered a lot of ground here. You know, we've talked about the history, the geopolitics, the role of the media. But I think the question on everyone's mind is, where do we go from here? Is there a path towards de-escalation? Like, is a more peaceful future even possible at this point?
Well, I think the first step is acknowledging that the current approach, the whole isolating Russia, demonizing its leadership, trying to weaken it militarily, It's not working.
Right.
It's clearly not working. In fact, it seems to be having the opposite effect. It's pushing Russia closer to China, it's strengthening their resolve, and frankly, it's increasing the risk of a direct conflict between nuclear-armed powers.
Which is terrifying.
It is. So if the current approach is failing, what's the alternative?
Yeah. What's the alternative?
Well, I think it requires a fundamental shift in mindset. We need to move away from this whole zero-sum thinking, this idea that one side's gain is automatically the other side's loss.
Right.
And instead, we need to embrace this concept of shared security.
Shared security.
Yeah, the idea that the security of one nation can't come at the expense of another. True security lies in cooperation, not confrontation.
Okay. I like that in theory. But what would that look like in practice?
Well, for starters, instead of expanding NATO, we should be exploring ways to build a new European security architecture that includes Russia.
So, bring Russia to the table.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Maybe revive the idea of a common European home like Gorbachev proposed, or explore some new models for regional cooperation that address the legitimate security concerns of all parties involved.
Okay, so let's say we do that. How do we get from where we are now to a place where that's even possible? I mean, the level of mistrust between Russia and the West is sky high.
It's going to take effort on both sides, that's for sure. The West needs to stop treating Russia as an enemy and start engaging with it as a potential partner.
So, what? Lift the sanctions, resume dialogue.
Exactly. Find some common ground on issues of mutual interest, like climate change, counterterrorism, arms control.
And what about Russia? What do they need to do?
Well, they need to clearly demonstrate a commitment to international law and the peaceful resolution of disputes.
Okay, so what does that look like specifically?
It means respecting the territorial integrity of its neighbors, refraining from interfering in their internal affairs, upholding its commitments under international agreements.
It's a tall order given the current state of affairs.
It is, but there are always glimmers of hope.
Yeah.
Even amidst all this tension, there are still channels for communication between Russia and the West.
Like what? Back channels?
Well, there's track 2 diplomacy, for example.
Track 2 diplomacy.
Yeah, it involves these informal discussions between experts and former officials. It can play a really valuable role in building bridges and exploring potential areas for cooperation.
So even amidst conflict, there were still opportunities for dialogue and understanding.
Absolutely. It's about finding those cracks in the wall and working to expand them.
And it's not just about governments talking to each other.
Right. People-to-people exchanges, cultural collaborations, educational partnerships. All of these can contribute to breaking down barriers and fostering a sense of shared humanity.
It's about remembering that we're all human beings at the end of the day.
Exactly. And these initiatives may seem small, but they plant the seeds for something much bigger, They plant the seeds for understanding and empathy.
So it's a long-term game.
It is. Building peace is a long-term process. It requires patience, persistence, and a willingness to see beyond our differences and recognize our commonalities.
It's about recognizing that we're all interconnected. Our fates are intertwined. And that peace is ultimately in everyone's best interest.
Well said. It's not about choosing sides. It's about choosing a future where dialogue and diplomacy prevail.
A future where hope triumphs over fear, where cooperation wins out over conflict.
Exactly. It's about building a world where peace isn't just an aspiration, but a lived reality.
And on that note of hope and the possibility of a more peaceful future, I think we're going to wrap things up here.
Sounds good.
It's been a fascinating conversation. As always, I really appreciate your insights.
My pleasure.
And to all of you listening out there, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast, which is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear.